What is the biggest geopolitical conflict that you've never heard of? It's the war over the Nile River. It's happening right now in Africa, and it could eventually lead to war. Let me explain. This is the Nile River. It's the longest river in the world and provides water and power to 11 different African countries. For most of those countries, the Nile is an indispensable resource, but two countries in particular rely on it more than any others, Egypt and Ethiopia. And these two countries have very different views when it comes to how they use the water. So let's go through this one step by step. First, we need to understand where the two countries are in relation to the Nile. Here we can see the headwaters of the river in Ethiopia. This is where the Blue Nile begins, then it flows down through Sudan into Egypt and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. Now, because geography plays such an important role in history, let's take a look back at a map from 1913. We'll start in the Ottoman Empire, who controlled this region at the time. You can see that the British were already exerting influence over the Nile watershed and beyond. They had colonies all across Africa at this point, and they were beginning to exert their power over the Nile. At this time, there was no formal agreement about how the water would be shared among the countries. However, as the British began to exert more control over Egypt and Sudan, they made several colonial-era agreements that essentially gave Egypt full access to the water of the Nile. The most important of these was the 1929 Nile Waters Agreement between Britain and Egypt. This agreement stated that Egypt had full access to the waters of the Nile, and no other country could divert or use the water without Egypt's consent. This essentially gave Egypt control over the entire river, and it's a situation that has lasted until today. Now, why should we care about something that happened so long ago? Well, because even though colonialism ended after World War II, these agreements were never renegotiated. In fact, the situation remained largely unchanged following independence. Ethiopia, which is located upstream from Egypt, contests these colonial-era agreements and has never signed them. As we can see here, the British did exert some influence over Ethiopia during this time, but never truly controlled the country. Instead, Ethiopia was able to maintain a great deal of autonomy, and they have used this to argue that they should not be bound by the agreements reached by the British and Egypt. Essentially, they say that since they were never a part of the British Empire, they should be free to use the Nile as they see fit. So what does Ethiopia want with the Nile? Well, for the last few decades, the answer was simple. They just wanted to be able to use the Nile in the same way that Egypt did. But since the turn of the century, things have changed dramatically. Now, Ethiopia wants to build a massive dam on the Blue Nile, and they believe that they have the right to do so. Let's talk about this dam. This is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or the GERD. It is currently under construction and will eventually become the largest hydroelectric power plant in Africa. The goal of the dam is to produce up to 65 billion kilowatt-hours of electricity per year, which would be enough to power all of the homes in Ethiopia and still have plenty of energy left over for export. You might be thinking, that sounds like a good idea. Why is Egypt opposed to it? Well, the problem is downstream. You see, the Blue Nile runs through Sudan and then into Egypt. The Nile provides about 97% of Egypt's fresh water, so they obviously need the water to survive. But building a dam on the Blue Nile could significantly reduce the amount of water flowing into Egypt, and that's exactly what Ethiopia is doing. The GERD will block up to 85% of the Blue Nile during dry months, and if that happens, Egypt will have much less water to work with. So let's take a look at some satellite images. This is a normal year. The Nile flows from Ethiopia into Sudan and then Egypt. But this is what it looks like during a drought. As we can see, the flow of the Nile is reduced dramatically, and Egypt receives much less water. And this is the same thing that will happen when the GERD is completed. Egypt believes that Ethiopia is essentially stealing their water, and they are desperately trying to come up with a solution. Ethiopia, on the other hand, believes that they have a right to use the water as they see fit, and that Egypt's complaints are unjustified. So let's get back to the modern day. The story doesn't end with the construction of the GERD. After all, Ethiopia had been planning this project for decades before finally breaking ground in 2011. The reason that Ethiopia decided to build the dam was quite simple: electricity. At the time, only about 45% of Ethiopians had access to electricity and less than 20% of the rural population had access. So the government decided to take advantage of their natural resources and develop the country using hydroelectric power. To achieve this goal, they broke ground on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam in 2011. At the time, they hoped to complete the dam by 2017, but delays have pushed the completion date back to 2023. Construction on the dam was halted twice due to droughts, but the Ethiopian government was determined to finish the project. They launched a national campaign called Filling the Great Rift, which raised money from the Ethiopian diaspora around the world. In total, Ethiopians donated over $10 billion to the project. Clearly, this dam means a great deal to the people of Ethiopia, and they are willing to sacrifice a great deal to make sure that it is completed. So what does Egypt do when they realize that their water supply is being threatened? They try to negotiate with Ethiopia. On the surface, it seems like a pretty reasonable request. Egypt simply wants assurances that the construction of the dam will not negatively affect their water supply. But as negotiations dragged on, it became clear that the two countries had very different visions for the future of the Nile. Egypt wanted Ethiopia to agree to certain limits on the amount of water that could be diverted from the Nile, but Ethiopia refused, saying that they needed the freedom to use the water as they saw fit. With negotiations stalled, Egypt turned to the United Nations for help. They filed a complaint with the UN Security Council but were unsuccessful. Most African countries refused to side with Egypt on the issue, citing Ethiopia's right to use the river. Egypt then took their complaint to the International Court of Justice, but once again were unsuccessful. The court ruled that both countries had the right to use the water of the Nile and that further negotiations needed to be held. Egypt has been preparing for this conflict for years. They've been stockpiling weapons and forming alliances with other countries in the region. In recent years, Egypt has received military aid from the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. They've also been in talks with Israel about a potential military alliance. The Egyptians know that a conflict with Ethiopia is inevitable, so they're making sure that they're prepared for it. Ethiopia, on the other hand, is also preparing for war. They've been stockpiling weapons and training their military. They also have allies in the region, including Sudan, South Sudan, and Somalia. If war does break out, Ethiopia will have plenty of support. But why do either of these countries want to go to war? Both countries have a lot to lose. A war between two major African countries would cause instability throughout the region. It would also damage Ethiopia's relationship with its allies in the African Union. The AU has been trying to mediate the conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia, but so far they have been unsuccessful. If war does break out, it would be a major blow to the AU's efforts to promote peace and stability in Africa. Who do you think will win a war between Egypt and Ethiopia? Comment your thoughts down below, and thank you for watching.